The dust had not yet settled from Stalingrad when history handed the Wehrmacht a name it thought it would never hear again. Sixth Army. Reborn from ash, rebuilt from broken divisions and desperate conscription, thrown onto the steppes of Romania to hold a line that could not be held. In August 1944, that name would die a second time. Not in the snow this time, but in the heat and dust of the Moldovan plains, in 10 days that erased an army from the earth so completely that survivors would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain how it happened, and never quite succeeding. This is the story of how the Red Army did it twice. How the same catastrophe, the same word, Kessel, encirclement, fell on the same army twice in 18 months. How 250,000 men marched into a trap that had been built for them in plain sight, and how almost none of them walked out. By the summer of 1944, the German position in the east was already unraveling. Army Group Center had been shattered in June by Operation Bagration, one of the largest and most catastrophic defeats in German military history, a collapse so total that it consumed more men than Stalingrad itself. Hitler's attention, his reserves, his anxious daily briefings, all of it was fixed on the smoking ruin in Belarus. And so, far to the south, in the rolling farmland between the Prut and Dniester rivers, in a theater the German High Command had quietly begun to treat as secondary, a second catastrophe was allowed to grow in silence. Army Group South Ukraine held this southern front. Its core striking power, the force that gave it any teeth at all, was the newly rebuilt Sixth Army, commanded by General Maximilian Frederico and soon by General Karl Adolf Hollet. Alongside it stood the Romanian Third and Fourth Armies, allies whose loyalty to the Axis cause was, by this point in the war, thinner than the paper their treaties were written on. Romania had joined Hitler's crusade in 1941 with genuine enthusiasm, eager to reclaim Bessarabia and push deep into Soviet territory. 3 years later, with Soviet bombers over Bucharest and the Red Army massing on the border, that enthusiasm had curdled into something closer to dread. The man in overall command of this front, General Johannes Friesner, had been given his post only weeks earlier, transferred south after the disaster in Army Group North. He arrived to find a defensive position that looked strong on paper, 2 lines of trenches, minefields, artillery positions dug into the hills around Jassy and along the Dniester. What he could not fix, no matter how many inspection tours he made, was the simple arithmetic of the war by the summer of 1944. His combined German-Romanian force numbered around 900,000 men. Facing him, camouflaged in the forests and gullies beyond the front, were 2 entire Soviet fronts, the 2nd Ukrainian under Rodion Malinovsky and the 3rd Ukrainian under Fyodor Tolbukin, together fielding over 1.3 million men, more than 1,800 tanks and self-propelled guns, and nearly 2,200 aircraft. The Soviets called it the Jassy-Kishinev Operation. German soldiers who lived through it would later call it, bitterly, the Second Stalingrad. And like Stalingrad, it began not with a roar but with a silence that felt wrong. For weeks before the offensive, Soviet engineers had done something extraordinary. They understood that German reconnaissance planes photographed the front every day, that German intelligence officers pored over those photographs looking for the telltale signs of a coming storm, the freshly dug gun pits, the new supply roads, the tank tracks pressed into soft earth near the front. So the Soviets built an entire deception, a maskurovka on a scale that would have impressed a Hollywood set designer. Dummy tanks made of wood and canvas sat in obvious clearings, positioned to be seen. Radio traffic was faked to suggest reinforcements were flowing to quiet sectors while, in the real strike zones, absolute radio silence was enforced. Actual artillery and armor moved only at night, in small groups, always along different routes, always camouflaged before dawn broke. German aerial reconnaissance dutifully photographed a front that looked stable, even quiet in places. Friesner's intelligence staff, working with what they had, concluded that a major offensive was unlikely before autumn. They were catastrophically wrong, and by the time they understood how wrong, it was already too late to matter. On the morning of August 20th, 1944, the Soviet guns finally spoke, and when they did, it was not a warning shot. It was an avalanche. Over 900 heavy artillery pieces per kilometer of front opened fire in a bombardment that lasted more than an hour. A wall of high explosive and shrapnel that tore through the forward German and Romanian positions with a violence that left survivors deaf, disoriented, and in many cases simply gone, vaporized in their own trenches. Then the Soviet infantry came, wave after wave, backed by tanks that had crossed no man's land while the defenders were still shaking dirt out of their ears. The Romanian Fourth Army, positioned north of Jassy, broke almost immediately. This was not a failure of courage so much as a failure of will to die for a cause most Romanian soldiers no longer believed in. Word had already spread through the ranks that King Michael and elements of the Romanian government were negotiating, quietly, for a way out of the war entirely. Men who suspect their country is about to switch sides do not fight with the desperate fury of men who believe they have nowhere else to go. Entire Romanian battalions surrendered within hours, some without firing a shot, their officers privately relieved that the decision had been made for them by the sheer weight of Soviet steel. This was catastrophic for the German Sixth Army, because Romanian formations had been holding critical flanks, tying together sectors that German troops, spread thin across an impossibly wide front, could not cover alone. When those flanks dissolved, gaps opened that were not measured in meters but in kilometers, wide enough to drive entire tank armies through, and that is precisely what the Soviets did. By the evening of the first day, Malinovsky's forces had punched more than 20 kilometers into the German rear, north of Jassy. Tolbuchan's front, striking from bridgeheads across the Dniester south of the city, achieved similar success, tearing through Romanian and German lines with a speed that stunned even the Soviet planners who had built the offensive around the assumption of a quick breakthrough. By the second day, forward Soviet tank units were already threading toward the town of Husi, aiming for a link-up that would seal the trap. The generals directing this offensive understood, with the clarity of men who had studied Stalingrad in exhaustive detail, that speed was the entire point. A slow encirclement gives the enemy time to retreat, to reorganize, to fight his way clear. A fast one traps him before he even understands what is happening. For the German Sixth Army, spread across a front designed to hold a determined enemy in a war of position, not to survive a war of maneuver, the speed of the collapse was disorienting in the truest sense of the word. Communications broke down. Orders issued at Army Group headquarters described a situation that had already changed by the time they reached the units meant to execute them. Divisional commanders who requested permission to withdraw were told to hold, because Hitler's standing directive, unchanged since the winter of 1942, despite everything that had happened at Stalingrad, still demanded that ground be held at all costs, that retreat without explicit authorization was treason to the fatherland. Friesner understood the danger faster than most. He had seen this pattern before, in miniature, in the north. He requested authorization to withdraw the Sixth Army behind the Prut River, to trade space for time and avoid the very encirclement that was now visibly, undeniably forming around his forces. The response from East Prussia, from the underground bunkers of the Wolf's Lair where Hitler directed the war from behind maps and pins, was delay, then partial authorization, then contradictory orders that arrived too late to matter. By the time real permission to retreat came through, on August 22nd, 2 full days after the offensive began, the jaws of the trap were already closing. On August 24th, forward elements of the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts linked up near Husi, and the ring closed completely around the bulk of the German Sixth Army. Somewhere between 15 and 18 German divisions, along with the remnants of shattered Romanian formations, found themselves trapped in a pocket that stretched across the hilly, forested terrain between the Prut and the lower Dniester. It was Stalingrad's geometry rebuilt in miniature, but this time without a city to anchor a defense, without factory ruins to fight through room by room, without even the frozen ground that had at least allowed men to dig in and survive the winter. This was late August in Romania, brutally hot, the roads choked with dust, water scarce, and Soviet aircraft, now enjoying near-total air superiority, hunting anything that moved along the few roads leading west. Inside the pocket, the collapse of order accelerated with terrifying speed. Fuel supplies, already stretched thin before the offensive began, ran out within days, leaving tanks and trucks abandoned by the roadside, engines dead, crews continuing on foot while Soviet armor rolled past the wreckage they left behind. Ammunition dwindled as artillery batteries fired their remaining shells in desperate barrages meant to buy hours, sometimes only minutes, of breathing room for infantry trying to break out on foot. Soldiers who had marched confidently into Bessarabia in 1941, certain of victory, now marched the other direction in the summer of 1944, exhausted, thirsty, sunburned, listening to the growl of Soviet tank engines that never seemed to fall silent, day or night. Some German units attempted organized breakouts, forming columns and trying to punch west through gaps in the Soviet ring before those gaps could be sealed. A few succeeded, in the sense that scattered groups of exhausted, half-starved men eventually stumbled into German lines further west, men who would carry the memory of those days for the rest of their lives, waking for decades afterward to the phantom sound of tank tracks on gravel roads. But most did not succeed. Soviet mobile units, tanks and cavalry and mechanized infantry, moved faster than the retreating Germans could march, cutting off escape routes almost as quickly as desperate commanders identified them. Airstrikes hammered any concentration of vehicles or troops visible from above, turning roads into corridors of burning wreckage that blocked the path for everyone following behind. By August 27th, only 7 days after the offensive began, organized German resistance inside the pocket had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent military force. What remained were isolated groups, sometimes battalion-sized, sometimes no more than a few dozen exhausted men, moving through forests and ravines, trying to avoid Soviet patrols, running out of food, running out of hope, running out of reasons to keep fighting a war that had clearly, undeniably, already been lost in this particular corner of the earth. Mass surrenders began, first in small groups, then in formations of hundreds, then thousands, men walking out of the woods with hands raised, faces gaunt, uniforms filthy, many of them relieved beyond words simply to still be alive. The numbers, when the Soviets finally tallied them, were almost impossible to comprehend. Around 256,000 German and Romanian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in the Jassy-Kishinev Operation. Of the roughly 18 German divisions caught in the pocket, most ceased to exist as functioning units. Sixth Army, reconstituted with such effort after its first death in the ruins of Stalingrad in early 1943, had been destroyed a second time, in barely more than a week, in a country its soldiers had marched through as confident conquerors just 3 years earlier. The strategic consequences arrived almost as fast as the military collapse itself. On August 23rd, while the pocket was still forming, King Michael of Romania moved against the government of Marshal Ion Antonescu in a coup executed with careful timing, arresting Antonescu and announcing Romania's withdrawal from the Axis and its switch to the Allied side. The soldiers still fighting inside the pocket, still dying in the forests and ravines east of the Prut, were in some cases fighting for a government that had already ceased to exist, a fact that would only become clear to them, if it ever became clear at all, in the confusion of Soviet prison camps weeks or months later. With Romania gone, the entire southern flank of the German war effort in the east simply evaporated. Bulgaria followed Romania's example within weeks, switching allegiance almost without a fight. The critical Ploiesti oil fields, the single most important source of natural petroleum for the entire German war machine, fell into Soviet hands within days, cutting off a resource that German industry and military had depended upon since the earliest days of the war. Hitler had spent years obsessing over the defense of those oil fields, had diverted entire panzer divisions in 1941 to secure the flank protecting them, and in the span of 10 days in August 1944, they were simply gone, lost not to a titanic armored battle, but to the collapse of an ally and the destruction of an army meant to guard the door. For the men who survived, capture brought its own long and grinding ordeal. Soviet prisoner of war camps for Axis soldiers were brutal places, marked by starvation, disease, forced labor, and a mortality rate that claimed a significant percentage of those who entered them. particularly in the chaotic early months following capture when infrastructure to house and feed hundreds of thousands of new prisoners simply did not exist. Some German soldiers captured in the Jassy-Kishinev pocket would not see their homeland again for a decade, released only in the mid-1950s as part of diplomatic agreements between a divided Germany and a Soviet Union slowly, grudgingly, letting go of the last living evidence of its wartime victories. What makes the destruction of the Second Sixth Army so haunting, in retrospect, is not simply the scale of the loss, though the scale alone would justify the description of catastrophe. It is the eerie repetition of pattern, the sense that history, when a system refuses to learn from it, is content to repeat its lessons with escalating cruelty until someone finally listens. The same army name, the same rigid demand from Berlin that ground be held regardless of the tactical picture on the ground. The same fatal delay between recognizing a threat and receiving authorization to respond to it. The same encirclement, the same slow strangulation, the same final collapse into starvation, surrender, and captivity. German military historians who studied the operation after the war frequently noted that the warning signs were not subtle. Friesner had seen them. His staff had seen them. Even ordinary soldiers, sensing the growing quiet before the storm, the strange stillness in the days before August 20th, had written letters home expressing unease they could not fully articulate. What was missing was not information, but the authority to act on it. A command structure so centralized around the will of one man in a bunker hundreds of kilometers away that local commanders, however clear-eyed their assessment of the danger, could not save their own men without permission that arrived, if it arrived at all, only after the moment for action had already passed. The Soviet commanders who executed the Jassy-Kishinev Operation, Malinovsky and Tolbukin, were later celebrated for what military historians consider one of the most efficient, well-planned encirclement operations of the entire Eastern Front War, a masterclass in deception, speed, and coordinated pincer movement that achieved in 10 days what some offensives took months to accomplish, and did so with comparatively modest Soviet casualties, given the scale of the German force destroyed. It stands, alongside Bagration 2 months earlier, as proof that by the summer of 1944, the Red Army had transformed itself from the desperate, often clumsy force that had barely survived the opening years of the German invasion into a military machine, capable of executing operations of a sophistication that would not have seemed possible in 1941, or even in 1943. For the German war effort as a whole, the loss was less a single wound than one more artery cut in a body already bleeding from a dozen places. Combined with the destruction of Army Group Center in Belarus, the collapse of the Southern Front in Romania meant that by September 1944, the Wehrmacht had lost, in the span of roughly 3 months, close to 1 million men on the Eastern Front alone, a scale of loss that not even Germany's deep reserves of manpower and industrial production could sustain indefinitely. The war would grind on for another 8 months, through the brutal fighting in Hungary, through the desperate gamble of the Ardennes offensive in the West, through the final collapse in the ruins of Berlin itself. But for those who understood the arithmetic of total war, the summer of 1944, and the 10 days it took to erase the Second Sixth Army from the map of Romania, represented one of the moments when the outcome of the entire conflict ceased to be seriously in doubt. What remains today, along the quiet farmland between the Prut and Dniester rivers, are scattered memorials, small stone markers in villages whose names most of the world has forgotten, and the occasional rusted fragment of tank tracks turned up by a farmer's plow, a small metallic ghost surfacing briefly into daylight before being buried again beneath another season of Romanian wheat. The men who died there, German and Romanian alike, did not die defending a cause that history would vindicate. They died in the closing chapters of an ideology that had already consumed millions of lives across a continent, trapped by decisions made far from the battlefield, by a command structure that valued the appearance of resolve over the survival of the men who were ordered to demonstrate it. 10 days, that is how long it took. 10 days to erase an army that had taken months to rebuild after its first destruction, an army bearing a name that should have carried, by August 1944, an unmistakable warning to anyone paying attention. Sixth Army. It had died once already, in the snow outside Stalingrad, surrounded, starved, and finally forced into surrender in February 1943. And in August 1944, in the heat and dust of a Romanian summer, it died again, in almost exactly the same way, for almost exactly the same reasons, proving that some mistakes, when embedded deeply enough in the rigid architecture of a doomed regime, are not learned from. They are simply repeated, at greater cost, until the system built upon them finally, inevitably, collapses under the weight of its own refusal to change.